The German military-industrial complex from the Second World War is often portrayed and perceived as having been highly developed and capable of building highly sophisticated, superior weaponry compared to that used by the Allies. The reality was, of course, quite different, as the Germans began to implement the mass use of slave labor with an associated drop in quality, and were chronically short of several essential resources. Regardless, bright engineering and desperation led to introducing a series of new technologies, some being the first of their kind in the world. With this reputation, many conspiracies regarding German hyper-advanced secretive aircraft projects began to spread during the war. Among them is one that states they created a series of supersonic flying saucers. In the decades after the Second World War ended, in mass media and popular culture, German military technology and industry were often presented as significantly superior to the Allies. This is perhaps most obvious when mentioning the German Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon. In essence, from the German perspective, the Wunderwaffe represented all weapons that would help them turn the tide of the war, with this term being highly associated with German propaganda and desperate diplomatic attempts to keep their allies in the fight. This term was more actively used after the war began to turn against the Germans, especially after defeats like the one in Stalingrad. The Germans lost the war, which obviously showed that the Wunderwaffe were just a desperate attempt to increase morale and to fight the ever-increasing certainty of defeat. But despite this, these weapons continued to tickle the imagination of the less informed in modern-day culture. To some extent, there are mysteries that have emerged after the war, but many were either fabricated or contained just a hint of truth. Probably the best known and most infamous is the German Flying Disc project, which employed an unusual circular wing design. The history of German flying disc projects is rather poorly documented, and in many cases outright fabricated. These projects were allegedly related to German attempts to develop a vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL, aircraft. They were still surrounded by a veil of mystery and poor research, and they are often connected to mythical or even supernatural origins. It is worth mentioning that the sources regarding these developments are quite unreliable, as they are mostly based on eyewitness testimonials or secondhand rumors. It must also be taken into account that many of the written sources were made decades after the alleged events occurred. Another vital point to consider is the reliability of the main individuals that were allegedly involved in such projects. One such person was Rudolf Schliewe, who after the war gave an account of his reputed involvement in the development of a secret flying disc aircraft. According to the story, the German Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or Ministry of Aviation, appointed the young aircraft design engineer and pilot to work at the Heinkel-BMW design office. In reality, he had no verifiable claims to military service of any kind, relating to aviation or otherwise. His only known employment was for the U.S. Army as a truck driver after the war. Some sources mention that a certain Otto Habermal was also involved in these projects, but not to be beaten out by Schliewe, there is also no evidence for his military credentials either. During the war, different engineers wanted to reduce the length needed to launch and recover aircraft. One solution was to launch an aircraft vertically into the sky. In this case, such aircraft would not need a long runway, and instead could take to the sky from a relatively small area. But this concept, while tested over the years, was never successfully implemented during the war. Schliewe claims to have approached this problem with a somewhat unusual solution. He made plans of using a disc-shaped aircraft powered by engines using the so-called Coanda effect. This effect was named after the Romanian Henri Coanda, an aerodynamic engineer. He had discovered that when a jet stream passes tangentially to a convex surface, it creates a lift force that can be further increased by circulation. Schliewe presumably presented his idea to Ernst Heinkel, who was said to have liked the whole concept. This supposedly led to the start of a construction on a small prototype to test the whole thing, being completed in 1941. It supposedly consisted of a disc-shaped wing powered by an electric rotary fan. No official designation was allocated to this project. It is simply referred to as the Heinkel-BMW, or as Schliewe Flying Disc. In 1942, this prototype was allegedly flight tested, but no precise information about its overall performance exists. The assembly of a prototype named V2 was said to have begun around 1943. The testing of the Schliewe Flying Disc was allegedly observed by a group of some 25 eyewitnesses from the flight school which was stationed near this airfield. One of these eyewitnesses gave testimony to the German aeronautical magazine Flugzeug in 1987, 45 years later. But the truth of these claims cannot be completely verified with any certainty. This aircraft was described as a disc with an estimated diameter between 5 to 6 meters, with a height of an average man. They also reported that it had an aluminum color, and that it was held in position by 4 landing gear legs while on the ground. It managed to fly a distance of around 300 meters at an altitude of 1 meter. By 1944, the whole team that worked on this project was supposedly moved to Czechoslovakia, with the main base of operations said to be the Prague-Bely airfield. According to Schlieve, by this time other aircraft design engineers began joining the program. One of them was SS Lieutenant Helmut Zabrowski, who was then appointed base commander. Others included Dr. Richard Mitte, who may have also been involved in the German rocket development at the Peenemünde Rocket Research Center. But this work there was never verified, and so far no connection has been proven. Lastly, there was Klaus Abermol, for which no actual proof was ever found that he actually even existed, and surprisingly, an Italian, Dr. Giuseppe Belluzzo, who specialized in the work of turbines. The involvement of these two in the supposed project is unclear. Dr. Belluzzo claimed that after the war, he was involved in the disc-shaped aircraft project, but there was no proof. Lastly, there was Joseph Andreas, an engineer who was supposedly a consultant to the Heinkel-BMW Flying disc. After the war, he claimed to have greatly influenced the German disc-shaped aircraft project, but if this is true, or just his attempts to gain fame, is unknown. Schlieve claimed that, together with his team, they decided to proceed and build a third and even larger aircraft. The necessary components for the aircraft were to be supplied by Heinkel, while Bayerische Motorenwerke BMW was to have been responsible for providing the necessary engines. During the construction of the much larger V3, one member of the team proposed using an experimental radial flow gas turbine engine, which was apparently adopted. The V3 said to have been completed in the autumn of 1944. This aircraft was supposedly capable of achieving subsonic speeds and could take off vertically. As the war by this point was obviously lost, the Germans tried to delay the inevitable, and out of desperation, the SS became more involved in Wunderwaffe projects. This flying disc was said to have been one of them, with this supposed involvement helping to add another layer of esotericism. Like most things about this aircraft, its final fate is unknown. Hard to verify and often absurd claims mention that it climbed to heights of over 12,000 meters and breached supersonic speeds. Given that this was supposedly its early development phase when the previously mentioned test flight was made, it is dubious that such a flight was even possible with all the other issues. The last completed V7 prototype was said to have been destroyed by the Germans to prevent its capture. Some sources claim that the Germans failed in this and the Soviets managed to capture it, but no evidence exists in either case. Not surprisingly, the entire story about Rudolf Schlieve's work is in all likelihood a complete fabrication. Author G. Rendall, from UFOs Before Roswell, gives a quite detailed account of Schlieve's involvement, or rather lack thereof, in the German flying disc program. The connection between Schlieve and the Luftwaffe is not clear. While he is often described as having the title Flugkapitän, or flight captain, this was not an official military rank, but instead an honorary title given to civilian test pilots for their services. This usually included testing a prototype aircraft and testing newly built planes. Schlieve, allegedly thanks to his idea of a flying disc and pilot skill, was said to have been summoned to Heinkel. In reality, there is no evidence to support this, either of him being an engineer or a test pilot. His first public appearance and general mention of the flying disc project occurred when he gave an interview to Der Spiegel News magazine on the 30th of March in 1950. Schlieve may have been influenced to come up with his story by the Italian post-war flying disc stories. Especially in the late 1940s, Italian engineers showed great interest in designing similar aircraft. He claimed to have continued to work on this project up until the end of the war, when he had to flee with his documentation and plans. He set up a small workshop and the documents were stored there. In 1948, he claimed they were stolen by an unspecified foreign agency and never found. Despite claiming to have been involved in the secret flying disc program as an engineer, Schlieve, after the war, worked as a simple truck driver. As there is no proof of the Heinkel-BMW flying disc, the whole story seems like a fabrication. In his later interviews, he claimed to have been involved in other projects. It is likely that he was seeking attention from Allied authorities. But it is exactly this lack of attention from the winning parties, at a time when German engineers were in extremely high demand with both the Allies and the Soviets, that refutes Schlieve's story most effectively. The US Army was even organizing special operations to bring many German scientists to America, and yet Schlieve was ignored, even though he allegedly had a VTOL supersonic aircraft design at his disposal. In the end, Schlieve's story ended with his death in 1953, as reported by the German newspaper Deutsche Illustrierte. As it is often the case, the reality is often quite disappointing for those who believe in extraterrestrial and esoteric designs of German flying saucer projects. Likely the only circular wing design that reached some operational level was the Arthur Sack AS-6, and the only prototype would be destroyed in an Allied bombing raid. There were many other projects, but few went beyond the mock-up stages. Ironically, the Germans actually managed to develop and build in small series a rocket-propelled VTOL aircraft, the BA-349. While quite an unusual design, it was a real and somewhat practical aircraft in contrast to these fictitious flying disc projects. By the time it was flight tested in March 1945, it proved to be a failure. This concludes our look at the German UFOs of World War II. What do you think about these claims? Do you want to believe? Let us know in the comments. If you like what we do and want to see more, remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on a single video. Also, don't forget to take a look at our extensive collection of articles on our website, plain-encyclopedia.com. Thank you.